I can. Thank you very much. Yes, I can hear you.
Great pleasure to have you with us again. Thank you very much for accepting our invite. We are just about to begin. Go ahead, Faiza.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is one of our keynote session. We have 3 keynote sessions in PhD AGM every year. This session is dedicated to celebrated economist Dr. Mehboob Haque. Focusing this year's AGM agenda, Charter of Economy, Investment, Productivity, and Unemployment, this topic, topic of this lecture is how to unleash a productivity surge and inclusive growth using digital technologies. The keynote speaker for the session is Nobel Laureate Michael Spence. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Spence. He is a senior fellow at Hoover Institution and Philip H. Knight Professor and Dean Emeritus at Stanford Graduate School of Business. He is chairman of an independent commission on growth and development. His areas of interest are economic growth and development, dynamic competition, and the economics of information. Welcome, Dr. Spence. I would request Dr. Nadeem to start the session, please.
Thank you, Dr. Spence. It's always a pleasure to welcome you here. We obviously are waiting with great interest to hear your lecture, so I won't say much, except for you to please give us your talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I would prefer to be there with you in person. So let me share my screen. And while I do that, I will see how it comes out. So how does that look at your end? Is that visible to everybody?
You're fine. We can see it well. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
I might also add, Professor Spence, while you're setting up your screen, that we've called you for a very important lecture, the Mehboob Haque lecture. And I'm sure you know of Mehboob Haque. He's a Pakistani economist who set up the Human Development Report. It is very well regarded in Pakistan. So
yes,
it's a special honor for us that you're giving this lecture. Thank you.
No, it's a special honor for me to be to have the opportunity to give this lecture in his honor. So my objectives today are, first, I'm not going to talk for the whole time because I hope there will be lots of opportunity for questions, discussion, comments, and this is a sufficiently confusing world that I don't think I or anybody else thinks they completely understand all the forces that are at work and where we're going to end up. But my objectives are essentially to try to give it my best account of the current structural economic environment and the significant headwinds to growth. Most of these forces, I've come to the conclusion, are secular and not cyclical, meaning not transitory, and so they won't fade away. And then I'd like to discuss some fairly powerful tools we have available to us to try to, change course in the global economy in a way that produces inclusive, sustainable, and secure patterns of growth. But at the moment, I have to say, we're sort of going in the wrong direction. But that's where I want to go. So the current conditions in what I call a secular inflationary and negative growth trends that we're dealing with, regardless of where we are in the world. So one of the things that's become, I think, fairly clear is that we lived in a very long period, probably 4 decades or more in the post-war period, up to nearly the present, with deflationary pressures, and that is associated with the arrival of vast amounts of previously unused productive capacity via the developing countries and now the middle-income emerging markets. We could spend all of the seminar or the talk discussing how those deflationary forces operated, but I think everybody understands that they were there. And those forces are fading for a variety of reasons, but the main one is that we essentially we have a much bigger global economy with hundreds of millions of new middle-class consumers relative to, say, 3 or 4 decades ago, and we have much less unused productive capacity to bring on stream quickly in order to deal with this. And I'll show you a kind of crude version of a long-run supply curve later on. As a result, in the present circumstances, we have a persistent demand-supply imbalance, and that is giving rise to inflationary pressures in a very substantial part of the world. And we've shifted rather quickly, I must say, from a world that was essentially demand constrained to a world that's supply constrained, and where growth is turning out to be challenging. What I'm going to suggest later on is that the growth models really have to change to meet the needs of the world that we're now living in. I think everybody knows we have high inflation. I'll show you a little data on that later on. But in addition to the factors I just described, we have aging in countries that account for over 75% of global GDP. And that means we have reduced rates of growth in the labor force, and even in some countries declining labor force. We have rising dependency ratios. All of these things make resulting fiscal challenges depending on the way the social security and pension systems operate. But that's another headwind. And we have rising sovereign debt ratios in the global economy. In fact, we have rising debt ratios. That pattern, goes back to the great financial crisis and its aftermath. We had a huge uptick in debt in that context. Then it leveled off a little bit, but continued to grow. And the pandemic produced a surge that everybody knows about in the sovereign debt ratios. And we are starting to see very rapidly changing labor market behavior on the supply side. People, reluctant to work in certain sectors because they're either dangerous or unpleasant or both. The pandemic accelerated that. And so it looks very much like we're not returning to normal. We have, depending on which country you look at, significant labor shortages in major major employment sectors of the economy, like health, education, and so on. So these are new. These are patterns that we hadn't seen before. And then we have a growing sequence of severe and relatively sort of hard-hitting shocks coming from a variety of sources: climate, pandemic, the war in the Ukraine, geopolitical tensions, and this partial deglobalization that we've been watching. And that has led to an acceleration in a pattern that I call diversification of supply chains. That's not necessarily unwise in this world. If you were subjected to shocks and so on, but it may be the right thing to do, whether you're a company or setting policy at the national level for a country. But it is expensive. And the kind of clearest case of that is the very high speed, energy diversification away from dependence on Russian oil and gas that's going on in Europe right now, which is where I am at the moment. So this is a new trend. It's not going to go away. It's secular in nature, and there are elements of this that overlap with geopolitical tensions. There's this concept that Janet Yellen has called friendshoring. I think the right way to think about that is that some of this diversification will be in the direction, depending on which country you're talking about, of moving supply activity into countries that are viewed as reliable trading partners. In addition to all that, and all of these things, shift the supply curve, up and in, creating additional inflationary pressures and challenges to growth. We have a big monetary policy response to the inflation. It may or may not cause major recessions, but it looks likely. The risks of that are certainly increasing, but we have a huge downward reset in asset prices all over the world as a result of an environment in which we're likely to emerge with new and higher real equilibrium interest rates. That raises the discount rate. It adversely affects growth stocks more than other stocks. And then we have economic and national security as a rising priority. So when you take all these things together, this looks to me like something like a major regime change in the global economy. Almost everything that we used to take for granted, like monetary policy, can be used aggressively to support growth or recovery from a crisis like the great financial crisis. That doesn't, in a supply constrained world, it's very likely to produce inflation. So let me just show you some figures. So this is a picture of public debt globally over the past decade and a half. So it starts at the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and then you see another very large uptick in sovereign debt. I should pause on this because in some countries, this increase in sovereign debt to over 100% of GDP is manageable, but it implies, in the context of a rising interest rate environment, a very significant decline in fiscal space. And that's especially worrying for countries whose fiscal space wasn't all that large anyway. I'm thinking primarily of the low-income countries that are facing this and a host of other challenges, including shocks from the climate change area. So this is pretty tough stuff. Inflation itself is not universally high, but it's pretty high everywhere. Europe is running at about 11.5% as of October this year. The UK is at a similar level. The US inflation ticked slightly downward in the last readout, but it's by no means under control. I checked, and Pakistan's reported inflation rate, you all will know this better than I, is pretty high. And all of these things are being turbocharged by the spillover effects of the Ukraine war, in particular, the sort of very substantial increases in energy prices and in food prices. In some places, obviously, that causes a bit of a crisis. Singapore's high, Nigeria is very high, China's low, is simply because, I think everybody knows this, that the China economy is being depressed by the maintenance of the zero COVID strategy. And everybody I talk to, who's knowledgeable about the Chinese economy, says to say that when that zero COVID policy is lifted, it will bounce back. But this is an environment. I often say to people, there's a whole generation of people in the financial system and in companies that have never lived in a high inflation environment, or even one where the inflationary pressures were significant. So this is a kind of whole new world that, whether you're in business or in the financial world or in the policymaking world, it requires a different kind of mindset, perhaps one more similar to what we had back in the 1970s. Here's a picture of aging. I find this slightly interesting. So what this table depicts is it lists a bunch of countries or regions that are aging, the major ones in the economy: Europe, the US, China, Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Russia. And all of these economies, I just added up their total GDP and their total population. So you can see in that second column that the aging countries account for, down at the bottom, about 78% of global GDP. These are countries where the labor force is struggling to keep up with the demand side of the economy, and so it's a headwind to growth. The picture is different when you look at population. So if you look at the population of these countries, it's nowhere near 75 or 3/4 of the global population. It's more like a third or something like that. So the truth is, most of the people in the world, at least 2/3, live in countries that don't have the aging problem. But in the short run, if you're asking what's going to happen to global growth, that will be substantially determined by what happens in the countries that account for most of the global economy, and that is the list of countries that we see here. I mean, there are obvious exceptions. I don't think your economy in Pakistan is an aging economy. India is not an aging economy. Indonesia is not yet an aging economy. So there are major economies in the world that are going in a different direction. This is the asset price reset. I mean, you can do this in various different ways. I just put the NASDAQ in. Admittedly, it's more dramatic because the NASDAQ contains the growth stocks, and the growth stocks are being hit by at least two things. One of them is that they were overvalued as a result of the pandemic, where they grew dramatically, and people thought, I guess, or investors thought that these trends would continue forever, and that just wasn't the case. And the second thing is that a rise in the interest rates makes the discount rate higher, and that means that growth stocks, where a lot of the future cash flows are out sometime in the future, get discounted at a higher rate, and that lowers their value. This asset price reset is sufficiently large that it's going to cause pockets of distress in various parts of the global financial system. You already saw a little bit of that in the UK about a month ago under the rather brief Truss administration. But it's, I think it's reasonable to say there's an increase in financial fragility when you get resets of this magnitude in the context of a world that had gotten in the habit of accumulating a fair amount of debt because the interest rates were low, and it was possible to do that. And just a brief slide on China. China's growth has slowed to the current estimates are about 3.2%. That's well below their targets. And I didn't mean to go ahead backwards. But that's not likely to persist. The underlying dynamics in China are pretty solid. The science and technology sectors are growing. So when the zero COVID policies are lifted, and nobody knows when that's going to happen, there were a lot of people who hoped it would happen after the National Party Congress in October, but that hasn't happened, and there's still problems, or outbreaks that they seem concerned about, including a fairly significant one in Beijing right now. And so I think we're just going to have to wait and see. But when the Chinese economy comes back, and it will come back fairly strongly, in spite of some issues in the real estate sector and some and issues related to what the tech sector is going to look like given the aggressive regulatory activity in the past couple of years, still, I think you can count on a restoration of growth in China sometime in the coming years, in the coming year, hopefully sooner. And that will be a good development for the rest of the global economy. I don't know why I lost everything there. Let me spend a moment on, there's much talk of deglobalization. I think that people are worried that we are sort of walking away from the multilateral system that we relied on to enable growth in a very wide range of countries in the post-war period. The simple thing I think that needs to be said is full deglobalization is not really possible. The modern global economy is simply built, the domestic economies and the global economy are built on specialization, including international specialization, and you just can't undo that without consequences that in terms of productivity and quality of life that are so large nobody would reasonably expect the global economy to go down that road. But partial deglobalization is underway, and it's underway in all of the significant flows that define the global economy. It's underway in trade, in goods and services to some extent, although I will say services trade is growing extremely rapidly. And so, it's harder to make the case that we have significant deglobalization yet in the international trade and services, but it's occurring to some extent in the investment world and in finance, and it's and starting to rear its head because of great power competition and global, geopolitical tensions in the area of technology, and all of this is damaging in various ways to various different categories of countries, but it's not it's not a healthy development. Now, nobody thinks that we can sort of just go back to where we were. This is a much more complicated world with different requirements. And so it's a kind of modified or new version of multilaterally organized globalization that we need. But the trend at the moment is, I think, in the wrong direction for sure. And a number of entities. I'm going to, at the end of my talk, I'll suggest that there's a little ray of hope. This is a pretty unusual month in the global economy because we had 4 major meetings within a single month, November, and the voices from the emerging markets and now even Europe are starting to push back against this notion that the world is going to be organized around great power, competition between China and the United States mainly. And so if that gains momentum, that will potentially start us on a new and much more beneficial course, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. So the digital acceleration, it was real. I think what we saw is the survival requirements of the pandemic economy produced a huge digital acceleration. It's not all going to stay the same. The natural role for lots of digital technology is as a complement rather than a substitute. You can see that in education. Nobody thinks that that elementary and secondary school kids are going to have an entirely online education and thrive under those conditions. But we have now powerful tools in education and healthcare and a whole bunch of areas that enable us to enhance the quality of the services and importantly enhance their accessibility. There's just lots of people in the world who live in places that are relatively remote from dense centers of accessible services, and the digital technologies are a particularly interesting, important way of expanding access and encouraging inclusive growth patterns. Anyway, enough said on this slide, except that at the bottom I said, there was a bit of excess enthusiasm, and the valuation reset process has been, violent is probably too strong a word, but pretty impressive. The pandemic itself was an adverse event from the point of view of distribution or inclusiveness. The people who were hit the hardest were people who basically had lost their jobs. And those were sectors that couldn't, do the work from home activity. This is a picture from the United States, but I won't dwell on it. It's not the main subject of this address. The global vaccine rollout, which is sort of kind of faded into the background, but it was initially impressive in the speed of development of the vaccines. It was unimpressive, and an example of failed global cooperation in having the vaccine rollout extend to the entire global community. And so this is a picture as of about a year ago, and where we had just dramatic differences in the extent to which vaccines were accessible as you move through a range of countries from the advanced to high middle income countries and so on down to the lower income countries. This could have been done better. It should have been done better, and it exposed weaknesses in our ability, at least at crisis moments, to mobilize the requisite level of global cooperation. Supply chain congestion has received a lot of attention. It has turned out to be much more stubbornly persistent than anybody believed. The central banks understood that this was a problem, but they thought that it and a lot of other forces that were giving rise to inflationary pressures were actually going to recede fairly quickly. This one hasn't, but it is a transitory phenomenon. Unlike the issues that I described for Asia aging is a secular trend. The supply chain congestion is starting to sort of fade as a headwind to the global economy. But as I say, it has been
surprisingly stubborn in the sense of long-lived. And finally, in terms of uncertain long-term impacts of the period we just went through, the pandemic, I think one of the largest ones is whether there's some kind of semi-permanent effect of having so much disruption in the education sector globally, school closures, online education, etc. Depends on where you are, which version of that you got. But I think there's a considerable concern among people who study these things that, missing a couple of years of education at crucial ages may be hard to, sort of fully recover from. Now, so so when I think of all that, I think this is a kind of a very different world that we live in. It requires different ways of thinking about growth and inclusiveness and so on. But let me just summarize. I think of this as regime change. But if you have the following conditions and I'm reviewing what I just said, you have big sovereign debt overhangs, declining fiscal space, inflation and rising interest rates, this thing that I call a Lewis turning point in the global economy, essentially the fading of the deflationary pressures, aging and rising dependency ratios and declining workforce, substantial changes in labor market behavior, whether it's willingness to work in certain sectors or willingness to, desire to work from home and so on. All of this is kind of in mid-process, and we don't know the final outcomes. And then a huge increase in major shocks to the global economy from climate, etc. And you have a situation in which the experts tell us we have to invest $3.5 trillion a year in order to even have a chance of managing hitting the targets in terms of climate change and the energy transition we're coming into. And you're wondering what to do about it. I think the best and indeed really probably the only answer is you have to start looking for ways to relax these constraints. And that seems to me to look for ways to produce a productivity surge, and maybe also an increased labor supply by removing obstacles in various parts of the world to sort of increase labor supply. In lots of economies, that means, enabling more women to enter the labor force. In the advanced economies like the United States, it probably means better childcare. Better and accessible and affordable childcare. In some of the developing economies, it means essentially building the infrastructure and human capital that enables them to connect to the global economy. But the general point is this is not going to be a very attractive world, not just in the short run, but in the longer term, unless we have inclusive growth enhancing investments and activities. And one of those, and I'll talk about this at the end, is the global economy itself. I mean, the global economy is a powerful tool for producing growth. And if it starts to partially shut down, it's going to make almost everything more difficult. It will be bad for sort of the inclusiveness of global growth patterns. It will make it very difficult to accomplish the energy transition that in pursuit of sustainability. I mean, I personally believe, and we'll say later, I think it's almost impossible to imagine successfully managing the energy transition if you don't have essentially fully open trade in goods and services, investment in financial flows, and technology. It just seems to me it's a big enough challenge that if you tie your hands behind your back in blockages in the global economy, it's just hard to imagine getting the job done. And this is I apologize, this is a little crude, but it's what I think of as a very long run global supply curve. And what I was saying before essentially is, if you can see this pointer, is that because of the massive amount of unused productive capacity in the global economy that came on stream as a result of, the growth of emerging economies and the openness of the global economy. We basically lived in a world, and as demand grew, the supply grew with it. And so the combination of price and quantity response was essentially dominated by the quantity response. And there's lots of data that show, the relative price of manufacturing goods declined through essentially decades-long periods of time. But what I was suggesting to you, I haven't proved it, so think of it as a hypothesis, is that we're entering a period in which this long-run supply curve is much steeper. In a developing country context, this actually happens. It's called the Lewis turning point, and it's where the opportunity to gain growth and productivity growth by simply transferring people into higher productivity sectors in the urban part of the economy. It's essentially, underutilized productive capacity in the traditional sectors, but you can't do that forever. And when that loses its force, that period is called the Lewis turning point. And then the growth engines have to focus more on, within sector productivity growth rather than, just structural shifts into the modernizing part. Think of it as the export sector. So now we are, and a lot of those other forces that I talk about have to do with, factors that shift this supply curve up or to the left, which is the direction that we don't need it to go. Now let me sort of shift gears. The picture I just painted isn't that attractive, and I think it's fair to say almost everybody would agree. However they describe it, this is a pretty difficult global environment. Central banks are having a difficult problem, delivering on their mandate to control inflation. The consequences of doing that are going to produce big reductions in aggregate demand. It's the only feasible way right now of bringing supply and demand into balance. And if they don't do it, then inflationary expectations will get embedded. And then we'll need an even bigger, hammer to sort of take that out of the various economies in which inflation is raging, and so on. But behind that, there are these transformations. I'm not going to spend massive amounts of time on it, but I do want to, tell you that they're there and what I think they are. So one of them is just enormously consequential, and it is you all live as part of this, but it's the shift of the global economy to the emerging economies that now dominate or increasingly dominate the global economy. And this specifically is a shift toward Asia. And this affects everything. It affects the way global supply chains are organized. It affects where aggregate demand exists. It affects the location of economic power and influence and so on. And it's a side effect of very successful patterns of growth over a decades-long period. The other three are based on sort of science and technology. So one of them is talked about all the time, and that is the digital transformation. So 15 years ago, we had digital technologies. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 17 or 18 years ago, we had the first mobile internet in the iPhone. But this is a complex, multidimensional transformation, but it has huge potential. It also has downside risks and challenges we need to handle, like data and whatnot. But it's underway, and I think it's important to start thinking about how we can leverage these technologies to solve some of the challenges that we face now. Less talked about is there is a biomedical and life sciences revolution underway. It shows great promise, not only to advance well-being in the area of health, but it's much broader than that. There's an aspect of it that deals with agriculture, and plant resilience, and maybe part of the response to climate change, which is with us now. And finally, there's this huge energy transition that is, in fact, the sustainability agenda. So all of those transformations are underway, and what's making them particularly impactful now is that there are very powerful technologies and tools. I don't know why I keep doing this. And those tools are not only widely available, but they have dramatically declining costs. And that means that they're accessible and can be used by a wide range of people, whether they're scientists or entrepreneurs or whatever. And here's an example. It's just a set of things that illustrate what I just said. So on the upper left, you see the the composition of the global economy in terms of advanced and emerging economies. And it's, it just says what everybody already knows, which is the emerging world is now the dominant part of the global economy. On the upper right, you have the evolution of the semiconductor chips made by the world's most advanced semiconductor producer, namely Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And these are just stunning things. We're at about 5 nanometers now. This is a kind of product, map that TSMC produced. And we're within shooting distance of 3 nanometers. This is important stuff because these technologies are now sufficiently powerful, to underpin dramatic advances in artificial intelligence and other things, especially the sort of training artificial intelligence algorithm development. And there's geopolitical tensions around this. I think the United States is moving to make these technologies very difficult to access for China. And that's highly controversial and probably unwise. The one on the bottom left, I won't spend your time on, but one of the most advanced, artificial intelligence development research centers is called DeepMind. It's in London. It's owned by Alphabet, read Google. And they have figured out a way to predict the three-dimensional structure of proteins from the amino acid sequence that defines a protein, which is just a stunning advancement in the efficiency of biological research. And the bottom right is the cost of solar, which have declined by a factor of like 10 in the last 10 or 15 years. So solar is now in the right places and in the right grid, fully competitive with its fossil fuel competitors. And this one I love. So, again, apologies, but this is the cost of DNA sequencing, and it's slightly out of date. But basically, it behaved according to, similarly to Moore's law up until about 10 or 12 years ago. And then the cost started declining even faster. And now, if you read the literature, they're predicting the cost of a full DNA sequence, having started at, I don't know, 100 million, then 10 million, and then started to drop like a stone. We're talking about $250 and so on. So this is an extremely important tool in research and drug discovery and all kinds of things in the healthcare and biomedical science area. One very striking trend globally that I think gives us hope that these digital technologies are not just in the laboratory or in research centers, but are actually being deployed with increasing impact is this global explosion of entrepreneurial activity. So it wasn't that long ago that, you could probably identify a relatively small number of places where the major, innovative activity in these various tech sectors, the energy transition, digital, and the biomedical sciences. It wasn't just one or two, but it was a small number. It was highly concentrated. That's just not true anymore. All these ecosystems have spread out globally. So you have major advancements in all of these areas, and sub areas, so e-commerce, fintech, etc. Cybersecurity, cloud computing, pick anyone you want. In the United States and China, but India is rapidly joining the party as a result of the geo revolution in the cell phone and related areas. The data rates in India went from the highest in the world to the lowest. But it, we're starting to see it in Europe increasingly, in a growing number of countries, and it is spreading around the world. In fact, you can document that this is, going to continue to expand on every continent and be not the total solution to the problem, but a major force. And what these companies are doing is exploiting fundamental characteristics of say the digital technologies to address important problems. Either they increase efficiency, or they access new consumers who are previously inaccessible. In the fintech area, for example, you can extend credit to people who are part of the mobile payment system because you have data and you can identify who they are. And in the offline world that we lived in before, they were basically anonymous. There wasn't any reasonable way to provide these kinds of services to them. So this is pretty dramatic, and it's a source of not only interest, but optimism, at least on my part. So what we need to do, and I'll sort of finish off with a few slides a bit with kind of where we are. We basically need to do three things in order to change the trajectory of the global economy in a way that's that benefits everybody, in a whole range of different kinds of countries. First of all, we need new growth models. I don't know that we know what they all are, but they need to leverage the new technologies, and they need to leverage the global economy and the trade and investment and technology flows. Some of them will be in the energy transition area. A lot of them will be in the digital technology area. And these things overlap. Some of the developments in biomedical science will be an important part of the energy transition. Some of the digital technologies will be an important part of the energy transition, et cetera. But we also need new frameworks for economic management. I mean, the days when a central bank could try to engineer a recovery from a crisis by highly aggressive accommodative monetary policy, that just isn't going to work anymore, because it's going to produce inflationary pressures unless we produce a relatively dramatic change in the supply conditions in the global economy, and that's not going to happen overnight. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. Nobody, including me, thinks that we can solve the sort of current situation with supply-demand imbalances, inflationary pressures with a supply-side response. It just isn't fast enough. So the central banks are going to have to essentially hack down the demand side with interest rate rises. The more controversial part is they're also going to start reducing their balance sheets, and that produces a significant risk of sort of pockets of liquidity problems in the financial markets and pockets of instability. And so we need these new frameworks for economic management, coordination of fiscal and monetary policy, and finally we need a revitalized pattern of international cooperation and institutions that have the balance sheets and the governance and the mandates to get that done. And I think you all know we've been drifting, I sometimes say sleepwalking, in the wrong direction, as the global economy tended to be increasingly dominated by nationalism and a kind of non-cooperative zero-sum approach to international relations. If that continues, then it's going to be very, very difficult, even with powerful technologies that are within our hands, to engineer a significant pattern of inclusive and secure and sustainable growth. So let me just say, I mean, because the digital footprint is so large, it's almost impossible to give a comprehensive description of it. So, but many of us have spent a fair amount of time looking at where the digital economy is starting to have a very big impact. And the digital economy is increasingly the whole economy. We're just building economies on digital foundations. But I think I think, and not everybody agrees with this, that a very large burst of productivity growth is possible or even likely if we use these technologies effect. In addition to a productivity surge, I think that with the expanded opportunities for inclusive growth patterns, for bringing people into the economy, for allowing small and medium-sized businesses to address much, much larger markets. These are all there and available. And finally, you know, the artificial intelligence advances, the advances in sensors and vision and you know, startling advances in robotics. These things are all essentially parts of the same thing. Means that we're going to, I believe, in 10 to 15 years, manufacturing and most of logistics will not be labor intensive. And that has profound implications. It means, you know, it means very big changes in the global economy. There'll probably be some relocalization because you won't be constrained by where comparative advantage lies in terms of labor costs. The so-called labor cost arbitrage component of the organization of global supply chains is likely to be less powerful in the future, steadily over time as the digital technologies come in. And I think you all know the digital technologies have high fixed, low variable costs. And so as their penetration expands, the costs keep coming down. And eventually they just displace what was there before. There's a particular problem here for non-resource rich, lower income countries whose comparative advantage traditionally in the post-war period has been associated with, you know, accessible, relatively inexpensive labor. That may not be a powerful source of comparative advantage in the future. So there is an issue of thinking through for these economies, how they're going to connect to the global economy on the basis of what kind of comparative advantage, if it isn't in that area. And that's I guess, a work in progress, is what I would say. It's not necessarily hopeless, but it is a major issue for that group of countries. And lots of things will change. All of these technologies are disruptive. One of the things I think we can hope for, and this is a bit of an aside, is the global supply chains are opaque. There is no database that tells you what's going on in the global supply chains. So when we had this supply chain congestion starting a couple of years ago, there really wasn't any way to figure out what was going on. You know, you couldn't look inside. And as a result of that, I think, you know, the players in the game, so to speak, you know, the logistics players and the manufacturers and so on, you know, entered this period having, you know, gone through survival mode in the pandemic economy when the demand dropped off. So all the flexibility in terms of inventories and stuff had been driven out of the system by entities just trying to sort of stay afloat. And that meant, you know, the system kind of locked up when the demand surged as we came out of the pandemic. The balance sheets were big and all that sort of thing. But in addition, the response rates were slow because there wasn't any way to see what was coming. You know, the way you discovered it wasn't a good idea to order your products for sale at Christmas time was to order them when you normally did in September and discover they weren't going to arrive until well into the new year. So there is an issue of leveraging the digital technologies to increase the transparency and visibility into extremely complex systems like the global supply chains. I think this is not really yet a project, except for pockets of, you know, players in the logistics space, but it is one aspect of the global of the digital transformation that we're going to be underway. Inflation and its consequences, I think we've covered most of this, so I'll just, you know, let it go. The central banks are late. They're going to try to engineer a soft landing, but they may not. Finally, let me just say, on the globalization, or what we might call a partial deglobalization, you know, with the tensions between the United States and China being at the center, and sort of the potential for great power competition, including in a fairly destructive form to sort of dominate and then produce lots of negative spillover effects for everyone else in the world. It may just be that we're sort of, realizing that going down that path is not a very good idea. So the emerging economies as a group have been quite vocal over the recent past, not just in November, about why it is that they don't want to go down that path. So they have, by and large, not endorsed the sanctions associated with the sanctions on Russia, associated with the Ukraine conflict. And they've been quite vocal, that they want a revised version of an open multilateral system that benefits everybody to be reconstructed, rather than just giving up and moving to regional trade and great power competition and increasing fragmentation in the global economy. And that, I think that position is absolutely right. But what was interesting is that these voices got louder and clearer in November because there were 4 major meetings: the G20 in Bali, the ASEAN meeting in Cambodia, the APEC summit in Thailand, and COP27 in Egypt. And in all of them, this chorus of voices resisting the sort of a global economic architecture dominated by a, sort of strategic competition of a destructive kind, rather than a relatively high level of economic cooperation and a rules-based system. But in addition, Europe started to join in. So very recently, there have been statements from President Macron saying, Europe's going to go its own way, and it's not just going to follow the United States into the sort of strategic competition with China. The Prime Minister of the Netherlands, which is the home of one critical piece of equipment in the use of in the making of the most advanced semiconductors, essentially they have a monopoly. So if you can't get that piece of equipment, you can't make 5 and 3 nanometer semiconductors. Has said, we're not going down that road either. We're going to formulate our own policy, and we have partners. They include the United States and China, and Taiwan and a whole bunch of others. But we're not just mindlessly going to go down that road. And it appears to me that China and the United States, this is perhaps excessively optimistic, appear to have heard that message. And so I think that's the best I can do on that front. At least there's a chance that a wide range of countries with influential voices are suggesting that we don't want to go down that road. If we do make a change in direction, it'll be enormously important. As I said earlier on, there's essentially no chance of achieving climate change objectives at all without the full use of the global economic flows that are needed in trade, in goods and services, in investment. You saw that at COP27. The cross-border investments into emerging economies that need support, both with mitigation and adaptation, are absolutely crucial. And the technologies have to flow without friction freely around the world, or we'll just be tackling one of the world's greatest challenges with one hand tied behind our back. It just doesn't make sense. So I'm a little bit hopeful. Let me conclude with just what everybody knows, I guess, and that is where we are in climate change. So we have not peaked in total CO2 emissions, despite legitimate claims of progress in a number of areas. Essentially, growth is still outstripping a decline in the carbon intensity of the global economy. We're at about 36 billion tons now. We may peak sometime in the next decade, but we're going to have to do better than that. It's going to have to start coming down, which means we're going to have to see stunning decreases in the carbon intensity of the global economy if we're going to have any chance whatsoever. And it's going to have to happen sooner and later, because like the monetary case we discussed before, we're sort of starting late. These are the top emitters at the moment. So China, the US, and the EU are way above everybody else. You basically, the reason for putting this up here is not because these are important and everybody else isn't. That's not right. Everybody has to be in this game. But if any one of these major players drops out, I mean, remember in the Trump administration, the United States withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords, which is from the point of view of accomplishing the energy transition is a catastrophic development. Fortunately, the Biden administration has kind of reversed that policy and moved through recent legislation to kind of rejoin the effort. But you know, in any democracy, there's always the chance that you'll get another reversal. So you just have to hope for the best. But the point of putting this up is that there's some key players in this, both in terms of their current size and emissions and their potential future. I mean, India is not all that high right now, and on a per capita basis, it's extremely low. But India is potentially just an absolutely gigantic economy, and if they sustain the kind of growth rates that their potential growth, you know, indicates they may, then they're going to be in the same club, along with China and a number of other major emerging economies. And these are the pathways that get you there. So if you want to get, you can see in the green line at the bottom, if you want to get anywhere near the 1.5 degrees, you not only are going to have to come down very quickly in terms of total emissions. These are, by the way, what I'm putting up here is gross CO2 production-based emissions. You know, there's lots of discussion, sophisticated discussion of whether you should attribute the emissions to the place where the goods and services are produced or where they're consumed. But these are production-based, which means where they're produced. But the most important thing about their green line is it's got to come down really quickly in the next decade, or we're not going to make it. So all of this says to me that that we have to sort of maximally deploy the science and technology tools that we have available, and we have to remove the global. We have to free up our minds, develop new mindsets. Not take conventional wisdom for granted. And we definitely have to sort of stop the process of creating barriers in the global economy, because that's just pure negative at a period where we can't afford that. So with that, I'm going to stop and thank you for listening to me. And then I'll look forward, if we have time, to a little bit of discussion.
Thank you, Professor Spence. Thank you very much. That's a very good overview of the global economy. Interesting trends there. I just want to check how much time do you have in terms of question one.
No, I got lots of time.
Okay, good, no problem. Okay,
Let me stop the sharing.
we'll open up the floor. Let me begin by just simply raising a small issue. There's many trends that are operating in the global economy. The aging factor, the debt factor, the macroeconomic imbalances, the climate change, the pandemic. But I think one factor that stands out clearly is the political factor. It seems even the climate change, it's a political issue that we can't seem to come together. It's a cooperation issue, you put it that we need more global cooperation. We need to get away from the nationalistic policies. So that's a very important point. And how do we achieve that global political solution? That's a complex issue. But leaving that aside for a moment, you showed us a kink supply curve, and you said this is a long run supply curve. There are big kinks coming up, but at the same time, you pointed out a number of things in the digitization of the innovation stage, life science innovation, climate innovation, many other innovations, robotics, artificial intelligence. Now, the fourth industrial revolution has been important, combined with all these new things. We've been expecting that the supply curve would be shifting rapidly outwards. And that in this part of the world, we've also been expecting that our labor supply, of which we have a lot of labor, that will be unemployed, and that robotics will come in, and there will be a global boom, prices will fall. So in some sense, this pandemic has brought to the fore that inflation is rising, supply chain shocks have come in place. Whereas before the pandemic, we were expecting that monetary policy would expand outwards as much as it can, and somehow we'll absorb it. So now we suddenly come to a stage, this is not happening. Is it just the pandemic, or are these deeper trends in the global economy?
No, I think, Well, from my point of view anyway, although it's worth discussing, some of the problems are related to the pandemic. They're the ones that people tend to, because the pandemic effects are not permanent, as transitory. Examples would be some of the digital acceleration. You just can't expect that trend line to continue the way it was. On the negative side, that I don't think the global supply chains will be congested forever. But these underlying trends, are however we kind of bring them into focus. And all I tried to do today was to suggest that we ought to at least think about them. Are secular, and so they're part of a new reality that we have to deal with. But yes, you're right. I'm suggesting that we have a bunch of tools that give us at least the possibility of shifting the kind of global supply curve, where some crude version of that, outward and downward. Now, if you have, at this point, you have to sort of get specific about what kind of economy you're talking about. In economies that have growth engines that are not sufficiently powerful, growth and employment engines, to employ a demographic that's producing a lot of young people, as you just said, you can legitimately worry about whether, a lot of labor-saving digital technology is going to be all that helpful, right? So you probably want the technological impacts to sort of run in the direction of creating employment as well as inclusive growth patterns rather than the reverse. And I think, these platform-based ecosystems, which is essentially where a lot of this digital entrepreneurial activity is occurring, not all, but a lot, are, beneficial in that way, in that they generate economic activity, growth, and productivity increases, but they also generate employment opportunities, not maybe for everybody, but at least significant chunks of the population. Whereas, robotics, is a little bit different in the sense that, it's clearly labor-saving technology on the short run. I mean, if you think about automation is labor saving in the short run, and eventually, when you get to a new equilibrium, people are working alongside machines, right? And so the question is, what's that transition look like, and are there enough jobs? But I certainly didn't mean to suggest that the entire global economy is short of labor. I think, the dominant part is, or a very significant fraction is, but there's lots of countries, especially ones that are struggling with growth, where the combination of the demographics and the relatively low growth dynamics are extremely problematic, because you end up with young people who are unemployed. So that requires a different kind of mindset and set of policies and framework in order to deal with it. I mean, in some places where the fertility rates are incredibly high, I think it's hard to think of an answer that doesn't include some attempt, via empowerment of women and so on, to change the demographics. I mean, it's just, I don't think in my professional life I've seen, growth engines that are sufficiently powerful to absorb young people produced at the rate that a country with fertility rates in the area of 5 or 6 would produce. I haven't seen one yet. Maybe there is, but I don't know what it is. We used to say that, that a young population is a growth dividend, and it is when the growth engines are running, at a high speed, but only up to a point. And then beyond that point, you sort of overwhelm the kind of growth dynamics with the demographics itself.
So 2 more quick reactions, if anybody please, but 2 more quick reactions from you, then I'll just give the floor over to people. One is, how likely is it that the central banks in the world will overreact and create another depression like that in the 20s? Second is that, as you said, aging is a problem in some countries. But with all these technological advancements, is it possible that we, the younger populations, have a greater problem than the aging countries?
Okay, well, central banks first. Yes, it's possible. I mean, they operate with, difficult to estimate, very long and variable lags, to use the standard phraseology. And that means they're guessing, right? We know what they're guessing at, right? They're trying, to bring inflation down and not let it get out of hand and inflation expectations embedded. They can't do that overnight. And if they go too slowly, then they lose their credibility. If they go too fast, and by the way, inflation is in most places an extremely sensitive issue politically. I mean, you can lose an election in inflation in lots of parts of the world. So there's political pressure as well, as you pointed out a minute ago. But if they go too fast, I think what's going on now, if they go too fast, they'll crash the economy, and then there'll be a more difficult than would otherwise be the case, a more difficult recovery. But they don't have a roadmap for how to do that. And it's difficult everywhere. I think here in Europe, it's especially difficult because we have the additional pressures associated with the Ukraine war. Some forced migration, energy, dependence, a high-speed energy transition, which is also expensive. I mean, liquefied natural gas coming into Europe, on boats is just plain more expensive than bringing it in on pipelines from Russia. But the decision has been made that that we need to make this transition because that kind of dependence is not consistent with the desired level of security in the future. We talk a lot about. I'll just throw this in. We talk a lot about inclusive and sustainable growth patterns. I think now in this world we have to talk about inclusive, sustainable, and secure growth or growth patterns. The security has just become a kind of centrally important issue. Remind me the second part of that question. It had to do with whether you have a worse problem in the countries with the youth demographics or what?
Sorry, Professor Spence.
No, what was the
Second part
question?
of my question was that you mentioned aging population in the West are a problem. But
right.
I look at it from our point of view. We think that the youthful population that we have, 50% of our population is under the age of 20. We've got the median age, for example, is 23. Okay, now
that's pretty young.
In the new world that's coming, is the younger population a bigger problem than the aging population? Will we be left with armies of unemployed people, and how is the world going to tackle that?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, to be honest with you, I think that the commentary on, say, the digital side of the economic transformation we're underway tends to focus, because it's what scares people, on the labor saving side of the digital transformation, and not on the inclusive or the employment generating or side, or the productivity increasing side, or whatever. And it's just not the whole thing. So if you have a lot of labor, then I think the way both policy and markets will steer the economy is not to sort of spend most of your time trying to economize on labor, right? The incentive structures will lead it in a different direction. So no, I don't think a very young population, with a high quality education system, and sensible economic policies is a problem, unless the demographics are just absurdly tipped in the direction of high fertility and whatnot. So no, I mean the aging. I mentioned the aging populations because in those ones, the expanding the supply of labor in whatever ways you can and labor productivity is particularly crucial, right? I mean, labor productivity is sort of in the long run crucial everywhere, but I don't think you're, I mean, if I had to choose, I'd rather not have an aging population, but that's the world some of us live in. And no, I don't think it's a disadvantage at all.
Thank you. You just spiked us by saying good quality education and a good policy. Unfortunately, we don't have either, and we don't think we'll have it in the near future. So, anyway, question here from us.
Thank you very much, sir. You have mentioned that we need to have new growth models. One is energy transition and other one is technical revolution, investment in new technologies, digitization for increasing productivity. But will it not increase distance or inequalities between haves and have-nots? And even within have-nots, those who have better access to those technologies, they will be high earners, and the other will be very low earners, and the middle reproducible jobs or routine jobs will be replaced by machines. This is my first part. Second, Pakistan, country like Pakistan or any emerging economy, basically how it can come out of crisis when three engines of global economy, China is in recession, US has its problems, and EU has its own problems due to Ukraine-Russia war. So, and Pakistan, country like Pakistan is in its periodic bust cycle. So how can we come out of this crisis, or what kind of policies when we have high sovereign debt and these things are also not working in our favor? What sort of things you think are useful for us? Thank you.
Okay, let me take the second part first. So, I mean, one somewhat crude way of putting that question is, can you, essentially perform well when the rest of the global economy is going the opposite direction? And I think the answer to that is no, right? So you can do the best you can, but, if China, which is now a major market, and source of growth and a major market for a wide range of countries is partially closed down because of COVID and growing at less than its full potential. Europe is probably going into recession. The United States is more of a question mark, but may very well tip technically into a recession, certainly experiencing a slowdown in spite of the tightness of the labor market. Then can other major economies simply sail along, as if all of that wasn't happening, given the connectivity in the global economy? I think the answer is no. I mean, take an example. The monetary policies produce in the context of the global financial system, produce exchange rate movements that the dollar is strengthened. That exports inflation to all of our trading partners, whose currencies decline and who import from us. And then the central banks have to deal with that. I mean, Maury Obstfeld has said, we do a little bit more coordination among the central banks in exactly this dimension, or we could go into a spiral of tightening, with one side effect of which is to export inflation to our trading partners and so on. So the short answer is, I don't think, it's realistic to expect that, when you have as significant structural shifts and headwinds as we have now in the global economy, that any economy, big or small, can sidestep them entirely. But on the digital side, I'm more optimistic than you are. There are digital divides, and there are, gaps in terms of access. For example, I find the Indian case instructive, right? So India had, the mobile internet, but it had the highest data rates in the world in 2010, or if not the highest, at least somewhere close to the highest. And that, meant that a whole bunch of people basically couldn't use the mobile internet. And in addition, it was kind of slow. It was sort of, two technologies back. in terms of data rates. And if you have slow data rates, then a lot of things that you want to use the mobile internet for, including supporting inclusive growth patterns and digital ecosystems and the development of, a whole range of services on the internet, just doesn't work, right? If the speeds are too slow. But India, without a huge public sector investment, because it was engineered essentially by the Reliance Industries, an energy company that decided to go into this field, and then had partners invest alongside them, the Google and Facebook and a whole bunch of others, some premier private equity firms. So that now they have the lowest data rates in the world. The equipment's fairly cheap. The rate of return on investment's high because Reliance Geo has integrated forward into the digital ecosystem that they helped, they substantially created by virtue of this upstream investment. So I think if you go about this the right way and think about it the right way, you don't have to live with these sort of digital divides forever. You just need the requisite infrastructure and a bunch of sensible policies that one of the things that's really important for policymakers to understand is that, if you go down the road of investing and creating the conditions where these ecosystems develop, then you're really supporting really powerful, entrepreneurial activity, growth engines, inclusive growth patterns, and so on. And one of the things I find encouraging is this starting to happen around the world, not perhaps yet everywhere, but close. You can find unicorns being created in African countries now. There are not as many as there are in some of the Asian countries, but I think it's just a matter of time. So I'm not a great believer that there's some sort of permanent, let me put it differently. I think it takes policy mistakes in order to have a persistent digital divide. The technologies are now affordable. The infrastructure isn't cheap, but it's not so expensive that you can't get there. I think you can close these gaps, and what it takes is people who understand, have a vision of how inclusive the growth patterns can be. Once everybody has a digital identity, access to the internet at relatively high speeds and low cost data rates, and so on. Then I think you open the possibility of a relatively explosive and attractive set of growth options.
Thank you, Professor Spence. Thank you very much. We will be hopefully calling on you again and again. There's a lot to learn from you. This is a beautiful talk, a very nice talk. Really enjoyed it. And inshallah, whenever you have the time, we'd like to get you to come to Pakistan, come and see this country. It gets a very bad press, but it's not bad as it sounds on the BBC or the CNN. And so with that, I thank you, and we'll see you again very shortly. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
आ जाए
Start. Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm Mohammed Faisal Ali, currently working as agriculture policy specialist with SCAPS International. And the research that I'm going to share with you people is on identifying farmers' willingness to pay for disaster risks in Punjab, Pakistan, and application of discrete choice experiment. It is now undisputed that climate has changed and okay. Again,
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you all for participating in this session. I am Dr. Haque and I'll be chairing this session. With me, the discussants are Vedant Farooq Saab and Rafiullah Saab. This is the first presenter and his topic is identifying farmers' willingness to pay for disaster risk in Pakistan in the context of climate change and application of the discrete choice experiments. The presenter is Mohammed Faisal Ali. Faisal Ali, you have about 15 minutes for presentation, and then we'll have 5 minutes for question answer and 5 minutes for the discussion. Thank you. So you may start.
okay, I'm Mohammed Faisal Ali, and you know already the title of my presentation. This is the outline of my presentation, like introduction, data, methodology, findings, conclusion, limitations, and areas for the future research. As we all know that it is now undisputed climate has changed, and Pakistan is one of those countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. Okay. That are most vulnerable to climate change. Pakistan is one of those countries. According to the findings of the Global Climate Risk Index by the German Watch, Pakistan has been ranked 8th most affected country for the past 20 years with $3,771 million losses. And Pakistan also ranked 5th most affected country for the year 2019 and 20. And when we have the recent figures, maybe Pakistan will be on the top. And this situation is becomes crucial because there are studies that are showing that extreme weather events would become more frequent in the future, and their intensity and magnitude is also projected to be greater in Pakistan. What does it mean? It means we are going to face high social concerns, high environmental and economic concerns, and these becomes more crucial for the Pakistan because Pakistan is an agricultural dependent country that is affected by the climate change, because Pakistan is earning a large share of its national income from agriculture. Its recent figures are 22.7%, and it is also the largest employer of the country by providing employment to 37.4% labor force. Pakistan industrial income is also dependent on the agricultural income. So you can imagine how much national income is going to be affected by these changes and threats. What is the disaster for a society? It is a blend of potential threats and social, economic, and physical vulnerabilities that doesn't appear as one-time event with one impulsive impact. They appear in vulnerable communities, but the reasons are loss of income. They cause a consistent loss of income sources, livelihood assets, fertility, and homes over time. And we are facing these risks. So there is need to manage or transfer these kinds of risks. And so for this study, we take flood as a catastrophic risk. You already seen a few days ago, recently we bared again high cost of flooding. Almost $15 billion were lost in this flood. 33 million population is affected. 30% Pakistan was underwater. 8 million people were displaced due to this. So there are two kinds of solutions to deal with these catastrophics. One are the hard solutions, another are the soft solutions. Hard solutions include building of dams, dikes like this, but they need both time and money. And the other soft solutions include insurance to manage this. Although there is insurance for the crops, but not it is provision in Pakistan for these kinds of risks. So this study targeted the acceptability and potential of insurance for the crops as a risk transfer tool for financial risks associated with the flood events in Pakistan. We collected data from two different agroecological zones, mixed cropping zone and cotton sugarcane zone. And we purposely selected one district from each agroecological zone, District Jhang from the mixed cropping zone and District Rajanpur from the sugarcane cotton zone. For this purpose, we interviewed 284 farmers. Usually two kinds of methodologies are used for this purpose, contingent evaluation and discrete choice experiment, but we prefer discrete choice experiment. Why? We prefer discrete choice experiment as it presents a real market situation where respondents have to choose a preferred alternative among different presented alternatives. It also presents a number of choice alternatives to respondents. These alternatives have same attributes, but the levels of attributes vary among the alternatives as contrary to the contingent evaluation. The no choice option is also included in this methodology to avoid the forced choices. So we can hear this and interpret these estimations in a standard economic welfare terms. And this methodology also helps to overcome the protest problem as compared to the contingent valuation, because respondents are not directly asked for monetary valuation. Instead, they are asked indirectly by getting that monetary attribute as only one of the number of attributes used in the experiments. So this is the methodology, the consumer choice and random utility theory, where UI is the farmer, I is choosing among the different alternatives, and VIJ is the deterministic part. And this methodology is completed in 3 different steps. Firstly, focus group discussions are conducted to pick the most appropriate, relevant, and accurate attributes and their levels. And secondly, experimental designs were performed to narrow down the choice set so that respondents can respond in a reasonable time, less cognitive burden on the respondents. Thirdly, appropriate econometric models were run. Survey development. As risk is associated to future climate, as risk associated to future climate is considered an important determinant of willingness to pay. So we decided to study the future or hypothetical context they are going to face in the future, and what are the probabilities for. So for that purpose, before estimating the insurance, introducing the insurance product, we built 3 9 hypothetical contexts with 3 attributes: flood probability, inundation depth, the height of the water, and the evacuation time, how much time that water is taking away from that flooded area. These were the attributes and their levels that used in this study. And if we run the full factorial design, there will be 27 total contexts, but they will create a logical burden on the respondent. So we run a partial factorial design using the SAS 9.3. This was the climate context. Here you can see this is the one of the climate contexts that were presented to the farmers, that you are going to face the flood after every year. And this is the height of the water, the shoulder height, and this flood will take 4 weeks to evacuate it from your flooded area. So what are your expected losses? This context were built by considering only for one crop, sugarcane crop, and per acre basis. I mean, this is not other crops. Is liani isme shamil ki gayi. They don't allow this much variation of losses, because if such situation happens in the cotton crop will wash away completely. So we choose sugarcane crops, and then we also ask the respondent to tell how likely this climate context would occur. This is the choice insurance product that is presented to the farmer with 2 attributes: insurance cover and premium, with 3 different levels. And they also, we presented 2 different policies to each respondent and 8 different choice cards, and also no choice policy to the farmer. And this no choice policy is also backed by the follow-up question that if you are not choosing any policy, what are the reasons behind no choice? Either you are not choosing this insurance because of the religious concerns or affordability matters. So the effect of attributes of the product on choice decisions are captured with the help of the conditional logic model. Whereas there is a person who is making the decision, the characteristics of that person who is making the choice decisions, their impact of the characteristics on the choice decision are captured with the multi-noble logic model. Here we ran 2 models. One, the policies presented in A as a reference category with no choice policy, and policies presented in B option as compared to the C, the no choice option. So here is the C is the reference category, the no choice. Findings: the mean age of the farmers were 44 years with 5.7 years of schooling and 22 years farming experience. Average household size was 6 persons and total cultivated area 7 acres. Hey, this is the current scenario they are facing right now, and in these usually they are facing flood after every 1 year or 2 years. You can see in the first graph. And the second one is indicating the severity of the flood. They are facing usually flood with shoulder height water or even overhead water. And this water height is higher in district Rajanpur. Usually this water takes 3 to 8 weeks to wash away or to move away from the flooded area. And one thing that is notable in this, usually in district Rajanpur, it takes a longer time to evacuate. So here are the findings of the conditional logic model. We see they are significantly explaining the behavior of the choice decisions. If they have higher insurance cover, the positive and significant is explaining that they are more likely to make a choice decision. On other hand, when if the premium is higher, the negative sign has indicated that they will be less likely to make a choice decision. But the combined with the interaction effect is indicating that they are inclined to make a choice decision. They will make the choice decision if the higher premium is offered with the higher insurance cover. If insurance cover is less, they will not make a choice decision. And the fact here we see the positive and significant effect of the age, education, and family size, and positively, whereas the farming experience it's negative. on the choice decision. So we see these are the no choice summary that how farmers are responding to each choice presented to them. Usually they from 13% to 35% farmers choose no choice. Why they choose no choice? There are the reasons as contrary to the expectation that religion is a major reason in Pakistan not using any insurance. Here we find different thing because affordability matter a lot. You see the higher pillars that affordability matter more than the religion reasons in the study area. So the conclusions, the study presented novel information on farmers' expectations. Due to time shortage, I excluded the Probit model findings on climate context findings, but I put them in the appendix. If someone is interested to see them or just want to discuss with me, we can discuss after this. This research brings forward the acceptability of the insurance in the study area. Is also introduced the hypothetical insurance product for the crop losses due to floods and flood insurance as a good way out in managing the catastrophic risk. As farmers' choice decisions were found to be greatly dependent on the choice attributes insurance cover, so they are important, and premium is more important than the cover. And farmers were willing to pay for the insurance product, but affordability matters. Usually two kinds of things we see while managing these kinds of catastrophic risks, coverage for the flood damages like in the developed countries, and the compensation mechanism after the facing the floods. We usually follow the compensation mechanism here. So we can adopt the crop insurance to manage this kind of flood risks. Limitations. Discrete choice experiments cannot be used with too many attributes. Generally, there is no design restriction, but it will enhance the cognitive burden and it will make that choice decision complex. So it will encourage the respondents to apply a simple decision rule. So that's why it cannot be used with too many attributes. Discrete choice experiments for this study were also limited to the attributes related to the floods and the crop damages. It did not incorporate the livestock farmers or the other things. The limitation associated with the stated practice methods, as they always estimate the implicit benefits or prices. The areas for the future is we can expand this research to the other sectors and other crops, and we can also expand this kind of baseline research in other agroecological zone to make the whole area policy relevance. So thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Now we have got, I will take questions first and then I guess, or if you want to discuss. Okay, if you have got any question from the audience from Faisal, and then we will come to the discussion, Farooq Shah. Yes, please.
अच्छा जी, इन्होंने जैसे बात की कि इंश्योरेंस के हवाले से, तो मैं ये जानना चाहूँगा कि कौन सी कंपनी थी या कौन सी इंडस्ट्री थी जो कि इसमें इंटरेस्टेड थी। सेकेंडली, जैसे कि बात की कि फ्लड इंश्योरेंस वगैरह, इसमें अगर ये हो कि जैसे कीड़ों की वजह से या किसी और वजह से कोई क्रॉप इन्फेक्ट होती है, तो इस हवाले से फिर क्या प्रोसीजर होगा?
अच्छा, पहली बात तो ये है कि ये हाइपोथेटिकल इंश्योरेंस प्रोडक्ट इंट्रोड्यूस करवाई गई है इस चीज की एक्सेप्टेबिलिटी को चेक करने के लिए, इसका पोटेंशियल चेक करने के लिए, किसी कंपनी के डिमांड पे नहीं की गई, पॉलिसी रेलेवेंस के लिए कि इसकी पोटेंशियल है क्या। दूसरी बात आपने पूछी है कि कोई इंसेक्ट अटैक या इसके संग इंश्योरेंस के लिए, तो वो यूजुअली थोड़ी बहुत इंश्योरेंस ऑलरेडी हो रही है, लेकिन ये बहुत बड़ी कॉस्ट हम फेस करते हैं फ्लड्स की वजह से, इसको मैनेज करने के लिए मार्केट अभी नहीं है। अस्सलाम वालेकुम। सर ये पता करना था कि हमारे फार्मर्स जो है वो सब्सटेंस साइंस पे चलते हैं, वो आज के हमारे फार्मर्स जो है वो सब्सटेंस साइंस पे चलते हैं, उनको जो है वो आज में जीते हैं, कल का उनके पास कोई सोर्स ऑफ इनकम नहीं होती, तो उस हवाले में इनको इंश्योरेंस की तरफ राग़िब करना, वो उसके बारे में क्या प्लान है या पॉलिसी है या उसको किस तरह, क्योंकि हम उसका कोई, क्योंकि हमें जो एग्रीकल्चर ऑल हाइपोथेटिकल, वी आर जस्ट द पोटेंशियल ऑफ दिस, उसकी कोई सॉल्यूशंस में, क्योंकि फार्मर्स इसी वो इंश्योरेंस वो एज ए कॉस्ट देखते हैं उसको, वो सेव नहीं कर पाते हैं, वो सेव करेंगे तो वो जाके इंश्योरेंस की प्रीमियम पे करेंगे, फिर वो फ्यूचर को सिक्योर करेंगे।
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I think I'm audible. Just yeah. So this paper has considered that keeping in view the rising climate vulnerabilities, there must be risk transfer mechanisms that are required at individual, regional and global level. And basically objective is to improve the resilience of the farmers, because you know that in Pakistan, we are facing consistent shocks in agriculture. That could be droughts, that could be crop failures, price failures, output shocks, floods, etc., etc. So basically in this study, the author has taken the data from 284 farmers from Rajanpur and Jhang. And basically they have offered different basically hypothetical insurance models and try to attempt that how much they are willing to pay, keeping in view their nature of shocks, and they have attempted to measure 9 sort of shocks. So Faisal, I have 2 sorts of comments and I have few questions as well on your presentation. So first, you know, that topic is quite innovative because in Pakistan, we are facing consistent floods, and especially there are certain areas. Look at like right now, I think 2.6 million hectare, you know, that kharif crop that has been wasted, and especially in provinces where more than 1.9 hectare, you know, that crops have been. So firstly, you know, that your paper is quite lengthy. It's around 45 pages. So it's like a, you know, that mini thesis. And I think you have extracted this paper from some report or thesis because there are certain, you know, that inconsistency in number, table, figure, and numbers, equation numbers, right, for example. So try to reduce it. Second, I was expecting 2 elements in your paper because, for example, you have quite lengthy introduction, but in introduction, you have to add 3 elements. First, you know, that we have a history of floods, and there are studies in which, you know, that cost of these floods and disasters that has been estimated. So you have to add this cost, and it will show us that how much this study have the importance, because, for example, right now, the recent flood, you know, that its cost have been estimated, and it is more than $10 billion. So justify with 2010 flood, 2022 flood, and similarly we have certain others, you know, that. So come with certain. Second, you know, that in your introduction you have a lot of empiric data, but you have to focus on certain theoretical and conceptual frameworks through which you build your argument that how much this study has the importance. Second, you know, that you have used the discrete choice model, but you know that this model takes certain strong assumptions. For example, you assume that, okay, whatever the premium you are paying, basically, you know, that utility will remain constant. So practically, this is not possible. Utility will ultimately change because whenever your willingness to pay or premium will change, it will change the utility. Second, you know that in your, I observed that you have used lot of, you know, that model, discrete choice model, conditional logic model, multinomial logic model. And there is lot of, you know, that academic literature that you have placed. So I expect that in this paper, you have to focus more, you know, that on practical execution of the survey, that how you have executed the survey, how you selected the sample, whether this sample of 284 that is sufficient or not, and what sort of limitations you face, and what are the limitations in your assumptions. So these are my certain comments that will definitely help your paper. Now I have 2 to 3 questions. You know that as you have mentioned in introduction that you know that we require an innovative disaster risk management system, and absolutely we require that. You know that whenever we face the disaster, we just react in a hush-hush mode. We don't have any concrete model. But can you explain that like, for example, in Bangladesh or in many other East Asian countries where floods are persistent, and what sort of models they are using? You know that Bangladesh is where flood is quite common. So what sort of model, risk management model at community level or at public sector? Because you know that at individual level, this is not possible, that we have informal economy, we don't have insurance market that is right now in place. So whether it could be at community level, look at AKRSP, where community-based certain disaster risk management strategies that has been adopted. IFAD is working, many other organizations, they are working. Similarly, at government-driven model could be. So because you know that every research, it must have certain policy implication, it must have the demand. So what sort of model that are applicable in the world? Second, you know that as one colleague has questioned, don't be too much hypothetical. You have to interact with certain government authorities who are involved directly and indirectly in managing these disaster risk you know, that strategies. So what is their view? Because you know that tomorrow, if you want to sell this research to certain policy authorities, you have to sit with them. So their views, I think that must be incorporated, that what sort of system right now we have in place, because you know that directly going with farmers and interacting with them, making certain hypothetical premium 100, 200 or 500 or 1000, that might not be acceptable. This research must be selling. So I would suggest that interact with the supply side stakeholders, sit with them, and they can, and then try to develop a certain framework where you can involve the community, because without community, I think individual level, it might be nightmare. So it could be. Second, I have another question, that what is the implication of this discrete model in Pakistan? You know that. Third, I have the question, because you have run a lot of model, cumulative probability model, conditional model, multinomial logic model. I would suggest use only 1 to 2 model. Don't, because this is not econometric exercise. So don't use multiple models. Use only 1 to 2 models and come with concrete findings. And last, you know that my suggestion is that existing measures, whatever Pakistan is taking right now on climate hazards, they are mostly missing. So you have to add that.
Thank you, Sab. And if you can quickly answer, you know, all this, because we are running short of time.
पहले 2-3 कमेंट्स के हवाले से मतलब कि हिस्ट्री पे 40 इयर्स की हिस्ट्री फ्लड की ली गई है, पिछले कितने लॉसेस हुए हैं, कितनी कैजुअलिटीज हुई हैं, सर कुछ हुई हैं, लेकिन वो ऑलरेडी बहुत लेंथी है, वो चीज़ें थोड़ी सी मतलब इसमें से एक्सक्लूड कर दी गई हैं, इसीलिए वो जो हिस्ट्री है और उसकी प्रोबेबिलिटी जो हिस्ट्री की बेस पे एस्टिमेट की गई थी, वो मतलब इसमें अभी शामिल नहीं है, यानी बहुत सारा वर्क और भी है। आप अभी कह रहे हैं कि इसमें मॉडल कम कर दिए जाएं, अभी तो इसमें एक लिंक मजीद बिल्ड करने वाला है कि हाइपोथेटिकल कॉन्टेक्स्ट किस तरह से इंश्योरेंस प्रोडक्ट के डिसीजन पे लेके जाते हैं। तो पहले तो क्लाइमेट कॉन्टेक्स्ट को क्यों इंक्लूड किया गया, उसको क्यों स्टडी किया गया, उसके लिए उसको सेपरेटली ही देखा जा सकता है। उसको या तो टोटली उसको इग्नोर करके अगर पेपर को रिस्ट्रिक्ट करना हो सिंपल इंश्योरेंस प्रोडक्ट तक, तो ये पॉसिबल है कि हम कंडीशनल लॉजिक मॉडल और मल्टीनोमियल लॉजिक मॉडल के साथ एक अलग से पब्लिकेशन इसकी निकाल दें, या फिर इसको पूरा कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव उनका हाइपोथेटिकल कॉन्टेक्स्ट को इंक्लूड करने के बाद उसका इफेक्ट इंश्योरेंस प्रोडक्ट की चॉइस पे कैसे है वो देख सकते हैं। और सेकेंडली जो आपका पहला क्वेश्चन है कि डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज ने काफी मैनेज किया है, इंडिया ने बहुत मैनेज किया है फ्लड को, बांग्लादेश ने बहुत मैनेज किया है, उन्होंने डैम्स बिल्ड किए हैं, उन्होंने इस तरह के हार्ड सोल्यूशंस की तरफ गए हैं जिसपे टाइम भी लगता है, और वो उससे उन्होंने अपने लॉसेस बहुत मिनिमाइज किए हैं। आप सब जानते हैं पाकिस्तान इस हवाले से अपने काम नहीं कर सका, ना इतनी स्टोरेज कैपेसिटी बढ़ा सका है बहुत ज्यादा, तो हम वो सारा पानी जाया कर देते हैं जो इस सैलाब में आता है हमारे पास। तो मैंने कहा कि वो हार्ड सॉल्यूशंस हैं, दे नीड मनी एंड दे नीड टाइम, सो मैं इसीलिए सॉफ्ट सॉल्यूशन के ऊपर फोकस करके काम किया। बाकी आपके कमेंट्स मैंने नोट कर लिए, इनको कंसिडरेशन करेंगे।
ठीक है जी, थैंक यू फैसल अली साहब, and thank you Shujat Farooq sir for your discussion. The next presenter is Abida Noreen, and her topic is on the causality between household and government spending on education and evidence from a panel of 40 countries. Please. And for this and the next paper, we have got a discussant, that is Raja Rafiullah Saab. Razam, thank you. Abda, you have got, because we are running short of time, you have got 10 to 12 minutes for your presentation, and then we'll come to the quick questions and discussion.
All right, sir. I'll try my best.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum to everyone. My research paper entitled as On the Causality Between Government and Household Spending on Education, Evidence from a Panel of 40 Countries, and co-author with my co-author, that is Professor Dr. Panos from the Cardiff University, Wales, UK. This is the content of my study. The first section is introduction, which covers the significance, contribution, and objectives of my study. And the second section is a review of literature that covers theoretical and empirical literature review. And the third section is about the bivariate causality test, that is most advanced panel Granger non-causality test by Judice et al. 2021. And the fourth section is about the multivariate models, that is a dynamic panel data estimation two-step system GMM model. And final section is about conclusion and some suggestions. Here's the introduction. Human capital, a set of intangible resources, can be considered as a human capital required to uplift the productivity of labor. This set is comprised of many social indicators such as increased school enrollments, new learnings, knowledge, and expertise through trainings. These are attained by education. It relates to formal and informal education. Generally, it relates to formal and informal education. The emphasis of economists is different in each field. Labor economists focus on the effect of education on the individual's labor market outcome. Growth economists search for links between an individual's labor market outcome. Growth economists search for links between the investment in education and income growth at the macro level. And the development economists focus on the impact of education in less developed countries. And the central research question of this paper is to evaluate the tendency of household spending on education as a consequence of government's lack of provision for education, or is it the case that the government itself responds to the household's lack of spending on education, and what is the role of credit constraints? This paper doesn't constitute another study that relates education and growth, but one that focuses on an aspect of investment in education that is largely ignored in the literature. This paper contributes to existing literature by examining the causal relationship between government spending on education and household spending on education with the presence of other control variables by using appropriate causality methods and tests for panel data. Although there is an extended theoretical literature that examines the role of investment in human capital in driving economic growth, the theoretical foundations of the interaction of different sources of investment in human capital, public versus private, are largely overlooked. This causality composes a major instrument of optimal policy, and this is of significant interest for policymakers. There is a theoretical framework of my study. The first approach of neoclassical, which was developed by Solo in 1956, describes decreasing return in human capital or physical capital accumulation leads to convergence. Later on, Mankey, Romer, and Saleh, Martin, and Barrow, 1991 and 95, extend this model by including human capital as a third factor of production and so on. Economic theory is mainly concerned with causal relationships among social and economic variables such as government spending on education, household spending on education, and bank non-performing loans, unemployment rate, inflation rate, GDP per capita, and population density. Due to shortage of time, I'm skipping the empirical literature view, coming towards the data and methodology. Annual data over the period 2004 to 2018 for 40 countries are available data for variables. And this panel data set explored from UNESCO, the Data Bank of the World Development Indicators, IFS, IMF's the International Financial Statistics, that is online databases. Note that HEX-IT is the initial household funding of secondary education, that is a percentage of GDP, and government spending, that is also the percentage of GDP. And so on, consumer price index, population density, and other control variables, that is unemployment rate. Measuring the credit constraint is a bit tricky, especially for panel data. Some researchers use non-performing loans, others construct specific indices. Further, this study also employs other potential variables. And this is the list of 40 countries that we have utilized for this analysis. This is the econometric methodology. First of all, for testing stationarity, we have used the second generation panel Unuru test, that is IMPES run and Shin test. After that, panel Ganjan non-causality test by Judis et al. 2021. And after that, PCSC model is also used. And multivariate model, that is two-step system, GMM, that is dynamic panel data estimation, to tackle the problem of endogeneity. And most of us know about what is the endogeneity problem. The endogeneity problems means that the dependent variable in each regression is correlated with the array term of the regression. Therefore, least squares can't be used to estimate that model, and we have to use the GMM two-step system model, which also itself tackles the problem of endogeneity. And this is our model, where YT includes our three variables of interest, that is HEX, GX, and NPL, as well as other variables which may interact and feedback the three variables of interest, specifically that is CPI, inflation rate, population density, and unemployment rate. And the regression are specified as follows, that is equation number 2. And this looks like a VAR3 process, but we have not estimate through VAR. We have estimated each regression by using dynamic panel data estimation, that is two-step system GMM, and this matrix shows the parameters, that is contemporaneous parameters, current time period of each regression, and we have used 6 legs by using the criteria of Haque information criteria and Schwarz-based information criteria. And this matrix shows the lag parameters of each regression by 6 variables. And empirical results and discussion, second Unuru test, that is second generation Unuru test, that is IPS, which conclude that our 3 interest variables are stationary at level and difference as well at the 5% level of significance, and other control variables, that is population density and unemployment rate, are non-stationary at level, but it becomes stationary at the first difference. To sketch out a preliminary sense of the overall average behavior of HEX, GX, and NPL, figure 1 displays standardized cross-country average of the three variables. As depicted in figure 1, the two aggregate intensities tend to display a positive correlation most of the time, while the aggregate share of non-performing loans doesn't seem to exhibit a strong connection to them. Among others, the figure displays the characteristics sharp increase of the share of non-performing loans during the global financial crisis of 2008. Table 1 displays the result from the bivariate Granger non-causality test by Judice et al. 2021. And this shows the HPJ test statistics. The null hypothesis is that X doesn't Granger cause Y, and the table presents p-value for the whole sample. A subsample that contains only the high income countries, and a subsample that contains only the low income countries. The only bivariate causality that holds robustly across all samples is the causality that runs from GEX to HEX. All other bivariate causalities either hold is one of the samples or at most in two of the samples. Specifically, the results for the whole sample indicate that there is a causal relationship that runs from GEX to HEX, that is government spending on education to household spending on education at the 1% significance level, and causal relationship that run from HEX to NPL and from NPL to GX at the 5% and 10% significant level respectively. Although the bivariate causality approach of the previous section is useful as a preliminary diagnostic tool, it suffers from three shortcomings. For instance, the result of the previous section suggests that GX could be a mediator variable between NPL and HEX. If so, what is the direct effect of GEX on HEX? And third, to address more those issues in quantifying the causal relationships, we examine the following multivariate models. This table displays the estimated coefficients of the 6 panel regressions. In summary, this confirms the main result of the bivariate test for the whole sample and low income sample under the HPJ test statistics. That is only GX causes HEX, while the causality is only direct. Specifically, an increase in the intensity of government spending on education by 1%, that is increases HEX on impact by about 3% and decreases it the following year by about 2%. The latter is inferred from the fact that we don't find statistical significant mediators among our set of variables that would support an indirect relationship. Moreover, our estimates suggest that an increase of GX by 1% affects HEX both in the current year as well as in the subsequent year, inducing an overall increase in HEX of a roughly equal percentage. HEX induces a positive contemporaneous effect on GX and a significantly larger negative lagged effect. Both effects appear to be statistically significant at the 5% and 10% significance level. And these are the diagnostic tests. All the diagnostic tests are satisfied at the criteria of 5% level of significance. These tests demonstrate that the model is well specified because the two-step system GMM model has a higher value of AR1 and AR2, Sargan test and Hansen test, which indicate the overall validity of the instruments, and the number of instruments is also less than the number of the groups. That's the number of 40 countries. It will lead to being a good model. Oh, sorry. Our findings indicate that an increase in the intensity of government spending on education encourages household to increase the intensity of their spending on education in the same year. Not only they do so, but the percentage increase is 3 times higher than the increase in the intensity of government spending. For instance, an increase in government investment in infrastructure, say via an investment in school premises and computer labs, induces households to increase their spending significantly more, say by enrolling to private classes and purchasing new equipments. The overreaction of household to the increase in the intensity of government spending on education is followed by a correction the year after. And our findings suggest that households tend to overreact in the year that government increases its spending intensity by increasing their own intensity 3 times more. The year that follows, however, they correct their response by decreasing their spending intensity so that there is an overall one-to-one relationship between government and household spending on education. Interestingly, the result is not only particular, but also useful for policymakers, as it further shows that not only the causality clearly runs from the intensity of government spending on education to the corresponding household intensity, but the effect is only direct. Among others, we don't find any evidence that credit constraints proxied by the share of non-performing loans affect directly or indirectly the intensity of spending on education by government or households. Thank you.
Thank you, Abda. We'll go now for 2 quick questions and then I will come for our discussion. Yes, if anybody have. ये mic तो दे दें।
मिस मेरा क्वेश्चन इस हवाले से ये है कि रिसर्च पेपर आपने इसमें प्रॉब्लम स्टेटमेंट वो मुझे क्लियर नहीं हुआ, वो काइंडली अगर आप बता दें। और लास्ट में जो है जो क्या आपके कंक्लूजन थे 40 कंट्रीज को जो आपने इसमें स्टडी किया, उनका डाटा सारा आपने कलेक्ट किया, उस हवाले से किस नतीजे पे पहुंची, क्या पॉसिबल वे होना चाहिए?
ओके, थैंक यू। एक्चुअली हमारे पास डेटा लिमिटेशन थी क्योंकि हाउस होल्ड स्पेंडिंग ऑन एजुकेशन फॉर पाकिस्तान इतना डेटा अवेलेबल नहीं था। हमने कार्डिफ यूनिवर्सिटी लाइब्रेरी से ऑनलाइन डेटाबेसेस पे एक्सेस की और वहाँ से हमने डेटा लिया, इसलिए हमारे पास डेटा की लिमिटेशन है जो कि 40 कंट्रीज का डेटा है, जो कि डाइवर्सिफाइड 40 कंट्रीज हैं हमारे पास, जिसमें हमने एप्रोप्रिएट कॉजलिटी मेथड्स एंड टेस्ट जो टूल यूज किए हैं, वहाँ से हमारे पास क्लियरली जो कॉजल रिलेशनशिप है वो गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग ऑन एजुकेशन टू हाउस होल्ड स्पेंडिंग ऑन एजुकेशन है, एंड दैट इज 1-to-1 डायरेक्ट रिलेशनशिप। अगर फर्स्ट ईयर जो है इसमें बट इट्स दिस रिलेशनशिप depend on the timing and nature of a relationship, because if first year में अगर आपका government spending on education increases by 1%, then on the same time household spending on education increases by 3%. But in the subsequent year, the household spending on education, households correct their response in the subsequent year and decreasing the household spending on education by 2%. It means that there is 1-to-1 relationship, and we can see here in our multivariate model that is quantifying this relationship from the 2-step system GMM model. We can see here. $3.192. It's about 3% increases by 1% increase in government spending on education. But in the subsequent year, same HEX T-1 second panel, see the second panel first row minus 1.98. Minus 1.98, it means about 2%. 2% decreases in the subsequent year. This is the correction of the household spending on education in the following year. This is the main finding of our paper. Yeah, center research question is that already discussed in my paper, and here's the time shortage. So we have just research question, that is what is the causal relationship between government spending to household or household to government spending on education. This is the main research question, our problem statement.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So I'll keep it brief because I think we are really on short on time. And generally, it's a good paper, and it has to be a good paper because it has been accepted for the conference. So there's a lot of good things working for this paper. For instance, I think the methodology is pretty good. But alluding to partly the question on the floor too, I feel the problem statement and the needs to be defined further clearly. I get what you're getting at. For instance, like whether this causes for that or that causes this and so forth. That can also be a problem statement, but I think you need to crystallize a more solid problem statement going forward. It's a good paper, for instance, when it comes to showing off your econometric skills, which I also like econometrics and so forth. But I think you need to somehow try to incorporate, because it's a very novel topic, incorporate policy recommendations, concrete policy recommendations. And one thing that I really am interested in, for instance, you're already talking about how when government increases its expenditure, household expenditure also increases. I am, as somebody who works with household level data and household level micro data, expenditure data, I'm interested in like what kind of substitution is happening at the household level. So that is, I think, a very interesting question you can probably address in going forward and do even a paper on that. Like what kind of substitution is happening within the household expenditure that is causing this? Because if they're spending on this more on education, they're spending less on something else too. So that is something also very, that might be something that you can go down. So yeah.
Thank you, Raja Rafiullah sir. We'll go the third presentation, third and last presentation, and I'll be presenting by Muhammad Mahmood Aslam. Is he available? Acha, Aja, please, because we are running short of time. His presentation title is New Work Design for Knowledge Creation and Sustainability, an empirical study of co-working spaces.
Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Well, the topic of my presentation is New Design for Knowledge Creation and Sustainability, an empirical study of co-working spaces. So you are wondering what is new work? New work is like the novel form of the work which we all know. It requires more autonomy and empowerment, purposefulness and meaningfulness, flexibility and improvisation, and knowledge sharing and creation, collaboration and creativity. In this sharing economy, when people are sharing their homes, when people are sharing their cars, when people are sharing their meals, so people are also sharing their offices. So co-working spaces in this aspect provide this new meaning to the new work. They provide office spaces, they provide labs and workshops, they provide seminars, and they provide interaction and community. On the one hand, in the sustainable aspect, it reduces the cost of commuting, it reduces the heating cost, it reduces the it also optimum utilization of resources and space. On the other hand, when people are working together, it creates the challenges because there are no more boundaries between the different actors who are working together in a shared office space. So knowledge leakage, skill spillover, or competition among individuals might be happen. So the research question is how new work design influences knowledge creation and sustainability. So this is SECI model for new knowledge creation based on the novel approach of Noneka. Noneka is proposed this concept of BA. BA is the space which is a physical, cognitive, or virtual space where people actually share their knowledge and then it create new knowledge. So first is the originating BA. This is socializing. When people come into some space, they interact. So this is the first step when the tacit knowledge transform into the tacit knowledge. I'm sure you would be wondering what is tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is like you are doing things you don't know. For example, you are driving the car, but you are not thinking when you are driving a car like how you are driving or something like this. So next is the dialoguing BA.
It is more like the externalization. So if someone would ask you that how could I drive the car, then you start thinking about this, and then you start telling him like, oh, you can do this. So it's like the conversion of tacit knowledge into the explicit knowledge. And then it's a it's the systemizing bar. Systemizing is the, like, you think about like what are different steps, and then you make your own steps, combine your own steps with your own knowledge, and then you explain someone else like what is this driving a car. And then the exercising bar, the physical space provides you the opportunity to implement their knowledge, and then it turned into the tacit knowledge. You are doing new things which you don't know exactly know that how you are doing. So it's again convert into the tacit knowledge. So in order to find out this research question, we use this inductive research methodology on the novel setting of co-working spaces. I did my most of the research in Europe and North America. So we took the data from co-working spaces of Germany, and we collected data based on the sustainability, like the spaces which are more sustainable, and then they are more design oriented, less design oriented, their sizes. And then we collected data based on the observations, events, interviews, archival data, of course. And then we did this constant comparative method of qualitative study. I'm sure if you're a qualitative researcher, you might know about this. Yeah, we did all the checks in order to get the most authentic data. So this is the data structure. Like, first we draw the first order concept, and then the second order themes, and then based on these themes, we develop this these aggregated graded theoretical dimensions. What are our findings? What do you think? What is sustainability? Manifestation of sustainability in co-working spaces. What we learned that it comes into the manifesto of a space, like when you are more tilted towards the sustainability, it must be in your mission statement. For example, we are doing businesses for the revival of the communities. We are doing this businesses which reduce carbon footprint, for example. And then the community, when people, when the co-working spaces have the sustainability targets, they have the community which actually the people in the community are actually more conscious about the sustainability and sustainable targets. And then the physical space, this is the highest level of the manifestation of sustainability. For example, if you are actually adhere with the ideas of sustainability, then you are using such material which is eco-friendly. You are not building some concrete wall, and you are saying that you are practicing sustainability, and then you are using the recycled material, and then you are reducing overall waste in your environment. The other thing is the readiness of the local community. Just imagine, I'm from Lahore. So in Lahore, the climate is very, very bad. So is the community, is our local communities actually ready to reduce the carbon footprint or the greenhouse, this carbon emission from the environment? So awareness of the local community is also very important. And then the availability of interdependencies. Maybe someone wants to achieve some targets, but are there any institutions which are supporting you? For example, some banks, some local NGOs, some organizations which are supporting this venture. Then how new knowledge is created in co-working spaces? There are different zones in co-working spaces. For example, mutual zone where you can actually interact, then dialogue zone where team can collaborate, and then you have your own space, for example, meeting rooms where people don't talk with each other. And then the role of interdependencies, like for example, if there are people who are having their complementary knowledge, or if people are willing to actually participate in this new knowledge creation divide. Maybe you are sitting in a co-working space or you are sitting in the meeting room and you don't actually want to talk with each other. So the possibility of sharing or interacting or sharing any knowledge with each other would be very limited. And then we come up with the fourth sort of knowledge relationship. They are inspiration, problem solving, synthesizing, and co-creating. Of course, inspiration is the, like, you are seeing someone and you are saying like, oh, okay, maybe I should also do something like this. And then the problem solving is like you sought help from some other individual who is also working in this the same physical space. And then the synthesizing knowledge, you actively engage with each other in order to build something new, and co-creating, you are jointly experimenting to create new. So this is our process model. Basically, it shows that how community readiness, in internal roles and resources, exposure and priming of sustainability leads to the knowledge exchange. So where we contribute, what does our research shows? Our research shows when people are actually actively, when a co-working space is actively pursuing the sustainability target, then they mostly are hosting the homogeneous population. They are targeting the population who are working in the same domain. Of course, it is good for the sustainability, but the knowledge which is exchange is not novel as compared to when people are from diverse background. They are more likely to share knowledge from the diverse domains. We also have some limitations. For example, we didn't actually studied the concept like how it would influence the knowledge protection, copyright issues, or patents, etc. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mudaslam, and I'll go for one or two quick questions, and then we'll come for discussion. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two quick questions. Number one, how do you see the importance of Slack time in knowledge creation in different like firms and co-work spaces? And number two, which is relevant, how do you see the role of switching off knowledgeable employees to other companies?
As far as the Slack timing is concerned, it's not like the I'm sure you can see the spiral curve on this SECI model. We show that it's a continuous process. There is no like this is first step and this is second step and this is third step and this is fourth step. It's a continuous process. And for example, you are sitting in a space, so it's not like you are only exchanging the tacit knowledge and you are not exchanging the explicit knowledge. So there is no Slack time. Maybe you are learning, you are not learning some actively. You are maybe passively engaged with the thing. You are just seeing things, and you are seeing that two people are talking about some concept which is not relevant to you, but you are when they are discussing, you are actually learning from them. So this is the concept of bar, the physical concept of bar based on this Japanese philosophy of Nanaka. So there is no Slack time. I'm not sure about the second question which you asked. Yeah, tacit knowledge is like basically when tacit knowledge is which you get from the experience. For example, a carpenter is making this chair or this table. So this is the knowledge which he acquired over a period of time. This is not this is mostly the skills-based knowledge as compared to the explicit knowledge. For example, I am telling you like the method which I use. This is more like the explicit knowledge. So it doesn't depend like you are using the knowledge of economics and tacit knowledge of economics, and you are going elsewhere, for example, in engineering or something else. So it's not like that.
Yes, quick question. Is your paper applicable in Pakistan?
Yeah, of course. I'm quite
This
sure.
kind of thing, I don't think people like to say that.
Where are you from? If my,
I'm Dr. Adnan from your campus economic department.
okay, yeah, I don't know. I actually searched for if there are any co-working spaces, and luckily I find one or two spaces even in Quetta. So I'm not sure if you aware about that, but in Lahore we have like 100 of spaces, and in Islamabad like there are tons of spaces in Islamabad and Karachi. So of course the concept is going in all over the world. It's like 1.6 million people are actually working in these spaces, and there are 12,000 spaces worldwide. And in Pakistan alone, it's more than 6,000. Yeah.
Yeah, I will come for discussion.
Okay. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was a very good presentation. I got a chance to read through the paper a week or so ago, and I think there's some really, it's a very good qualitative paper, and but there's certain things that could be included. For instance, I felt for one that um, the language was like, I know it's maybe मेरी अपनी इसके अंदर जो है कमी है knowledge की, but the language was kind of cumbersome, you know. It felt as it reminded me of me reading Hegel back in the day in my undergraduate class. So it could have been a little bit, you know, more easy to read. That always helps, because fully if you want to, if the goal of writing a paper like this is to encourage policymakers and implementers to go on and change policy and be conducive to such things. Like you said, these things have grown in number. I am also originally from Lahore, but I am based in Islamabad, also in Islamabad and Lahore. Even in Pakistan, there are a lot of course working spaces now. But what I'm really interested in, and maybe this could something you can discuss in the next paper or so, or another work, is what kind of industries are working. Let's say even in Pakistan, what kind of industries are working in these co-working spaces? And I think there would be a strong element of services industries, and also a typical version and types of services industries that would be working in these co-working spaces, and how that affects what subsector you're in, and also the size of a firm, you know. How does the size of a firm is related to these co-working spaces? Because whenever I go to these co-working spaces, I see most of them are either startups, or they are even like something even before a startup or something, or at times there are these already established companies who are working in other cities, and they are opening an office in a new city, and instead of going for a brick and mortar office, they will go into a co-working space and so forth. So usme, I think there's some really interesting work that can be done both from a sectoral point of view and subsectoral point of view, and also in terms of the size of firms and so forth, because that ultimately will affect your original question, which is knowledge creation, you know, and I think there could be linkages there. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rafiza. I've got a very quick question because I forgot. I should have asked before the discussion. What are the three main components of sustainability in general?
Frankly, I didn't remember this particular concept like the sustainability. It's more about the environment. In this context, it's more about the manifesto, and then the other is the community engagement with the community, and the third one is the maybe it's physical manifestation.
So, I guess you are guessing this, which is not correct. I will elaborate that. Thank you. Thank you all for presenting. Let me, summarize all this, and then we'll go for the tea break, and we'll end up this. The first presentation was by Mr. Faisal Ali, and that was about the farmers' willingness to pay in disasters risk. And this paper actually discussed the acceptability of the insurance policy, that to what extent the insurance policy would be applicable or feasible to the farmers in times of, particularly in times of flooding. So that was a hypothetical model, and maybe it can be implemented in terms of once you take the data and as you start, getting the results. I guess that would be a very good model. So, and you also discussed 3 factors regarding like the premium and the region and affordability. So that's also interesting factors regarding the insurance policy. And for farmers, of course, they are important because most of our farmers are poor, and to what extent they would be able to afford this insurance policy. So interesting paper, and there's a lot of scope, and if it is, I mean, if the data is taken and it is implemented. The second paper was by Abida, and that was about the causality between the household and the government spending. And her paper actually discussed the data from 40 countries. She took the data from 40 countries, and there were 29 countries from high income class and 11 countries are from low income class. And her finding was that if the government spending increases, the household spending would also increase on education. So that's also interesting. If the government starts spending on education, the household spending may also increase. So that's also a model, and it can be, if the data is taken, in terms of if it particularly applies to our country in terms of this data, so that the result can be more interesting to see that how the people in the government would respond to spending on education. The third paper was about and he actually discussed about the new designs for knowledge creation, and this new designs for knowledge creation was actually discussed in terms of sustainability, and he actually discussed that how workspaces would be fruitful for knowledge creation. So that is also an interesting study, and if it is applied in the context, and we can see the result that to what extent that if we have some workspaces, I mean different types of workspace, how it can be, how it can be used for knowledge creation. In terms of sustainability, because this is my area, and I've written 1 or 2 papers on sustainability, particularly my paper is on environmental sustainability and its impact on SMEs, because my area is SMEs. As sustainability has got 3 main components. One is economic sustainability, the other one is environmental sustainability, and the third one is social sustainability. So there are 3 main components of sustainability. If you see this from all in general term, or in terms of if you see this from all over the world, these 3 components are actually discussed in sustainability. So I have also discussed in my paper that is how environmental sustainability, particularly in SMEs, how it can affect the performance of these SMEs. So thank you all. This was an interesting session, and I hope you have learned a lot from these papers. Because let me conclude this, because the main objective of this presenting this paper is that is to share the knowledge. These papers are not 100% perfect papers, but we can discuss and we can learn from each other. And these papers, of course, the suggestions from the discussant, or maybe from the chair, or maybe from the participant, that can improve these papers, and then they can be published, in some good reputable journals. So thank you all. And now we'll move to the T session, which is there on the block C side, yes, outside.
And